Okay. So where you want to find these assignments, so again, you can look on the schedule on the syllabus tabs, but these new assignments I've made available this morning are, I'm going to talk about the essay number 3. You can find that assignment sheet downloaded on the assignments tab. The explication, both of these explications are the same assignment, but you have to do one for different poems. So I have the different explication number 1 and explication number 2. I'll talk about what an explication is shortly. But these, when it says poem explication assignment, those are the same files for explication 1 and 2, but I just want to make sure everybody had that accessible to them. And then we talk about the anti-bibliography. And the only other assignment that I won't have talked about after today is the final portfolio, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself and then everybody kind of forgets what the portfolio is, so I'll probably do that in a few weeks, talk about that, but that will definitely be there ahead of time, way before you need to do it, and it's not that hard. So if you need to download these assignments, print them off, save them on a computer or flash drive, whatever you need to do, go ahead, you can do that on the assignments tab. I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to start talking about essay 3 first, because you need to know what that assignment is in order to understand the other 2 assignments, because the annotated bibliography and the explications both are relevant to essay number 3. So I'm going to talk about this. So essays 1 and 2 were smaller. They're minimum 750 words, and they were only about 100 points, so 10% of the overall grade. This next paper is a poetry research paper, and it's significantly larger, and it's significantly worth more, and it's higher stakes. So it's 2,500 word minimum, and I did not choose that. That is Lewis and Clark. So that's a really long paper. It's probably around 10 pages at least, but we're going to have the full month of July to work on it. Okay, so it's not just going to be 2 weeks, so it's going to be twice as long. And we're at 250 points, so that's 25% of the overall grade because it is larger. And also Lewis and Clark has a rule on this final research paper: you must earn a D or better on the final draft or to pass the class as a whole. That is not my rule. It is the college's rule. So you must submit this paper and you must earn a D or better, regardless of anything else that's been done in the class. So this is really important. It's really important to, start on it earlier, to break it up into sections, and not just do it the day before it's due. We'll have more time to think about it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I have the schedule for conferences and whatnot. I just talked about that a little bit at the end of the semester. The last week of class, I'll have that Monday, July 26th. I'll have a workshop day, and then Tuesday we'll have one-on-one conferences, and then Wednesday we'll have peer review, and then the final draft will be due Wednesday the 28th. And normally I would have just like that due at the end of the semester, but I have to grade them on that for the portfolio. So if you need to revise, you can, but I'll be grading that Thursday and Friday. For sure, I'll make sure I have time to do that. And so that's what's going to be the later on the schedule. So this is a larger research paper, is a poetry research paper, and I have kind of specific breakdowns for it that hopefully will make this a little bit more straightforward. I don't necessarily think easier, but more straightforward for sure. All the skills we've been working on it so far, paragraph formation, specific language, analysis, all that's still going to be really important, but we're throwing in other skills such as research and specifically poetry, learning those poetry terms. So you want to, you're going to do an annotated bibliography. You want to have at minimum 5 sources. 2 of those will be primary sources, and the primary source is going to be 2 poems. Okay, and then you're going to have 3 secondary sources, and those are going to be sources you find like somebody analyzing the poem, so like criticism in some way. You want to pick one author, one poet. You're going to analyze 2 poems for explications, which I'll talk about soon, and then all the other research you do for that will be the author of the 2 poems. So if you find 2 poems by Emily Dickinson, the whole rest of your essay number 3 will be about the author Emily Dickinson. It's really important. The 2 explications you choose will be in the overall essay number 3. But you're gonna pick one author, okay? One author, 2 poems by them. You're gonna be analyzing them for explications. And everything you else do will be about that author specifically. So the primary sources are the things written by the poet themselves, the poems, and then secondary sources written by other people about the poems. And so I'll talk next week about where you find research, how to find those information on Lewis and Clark's website and other places, in case if you are not familiar with research or Lewis and Clark's database yet. You should have enough information that you can write a comprehensive biography to the personal life and career of the poet. And I have a lot of the breakdown down at the bottom. I'll get to that in a moment. And again, it's really important. So we're going to be reading 5 poems, and next 2 days, Wednesday, Thursday. So that could hypothetically do some, inspiration. Maybe there's one of the 5 poets you really like. You don't have to write about any of those 5 poets if you don't want to. Maybe the textbook we have is ginormous, and it has a lot of poems in there. It has a ton of authors, tons of poems. It has a few authors that they have like a bunch of poems by and a breakdown and kind of background on them. You could look through the textbook. Maybe you already know you really love a certain poet and you want to use them. Or you could just kind of Google some poems online, okay? But either way, you want to pick one poem, and you want one poet, 2 poems to analyze, and the rest of the essay will be about that author. And you want to pick poems that are going to be worthy of analysis, not just you summarize for 2 paragraphs and then you're done. Okay. Everything all together, again, minimum 2,500 words, same format, 12-point font, Times New Roman, double spaced, 1-inch margins, all of that. When I have a works cited page listing the 5 sources plus you can have more than 5 sources if you need to. But you want to have at least those 3 secondary and 2 primary sources, and also citing them in your essay as in-text citations throughout your essay too. And have a title that's not just essay number 3. Going to utilize scholarly online databases, journal articles, reference books. Again, I'll talk more about how to do that next week, and we'll practice that. You want to distinguish among correctly document quotes, paraphrasing, and summaries. So not just necessarily quoting, but if you need to paraphrase or summarize too, you still need to quote that. Have MLA format, select accurate between quotation marks and italics for titles. And so that's something we've gone over already, but it can be kind of difficult. Quotation marks for smaller works, and then the larger works have italics. Analyze poetry using the terms given in class, which we're going to talk about today and was really important for the reading today, the textbook. And then employ the college level essay techniques I just talked about a moment ago. There's a breakdown. So those are the dates for the explication, which I'll talk about in a minute. This here on the second page of the assignment sheet is really kind of the breakdown of the format of the entire essay. So your introduction will start with a lead-in attention getter that would attract the reader's interest in learning more about this poet or poem. Again, you're always writing for an audience. Then you'll introduce your poet. You will have a thesis statement, a claim. You make a literary claim, and I have an example here. So don't use this, but you could say Lucille Clifton's poetry can be better understood and appreciated when readers know more about her life and her other work. So you could break that down, you can analyze that more, but because you are writing about her own essays, her whole life, it's much broader. You want your thesis to be broader than the 2 to 3 page essays we've been writing so far. So you're not just going to write about one poem, it's going to kind of embody everything together. Okay. The body paragraph, you'll use transition words and sentences that lead into and tie the paragraphs together. So you'll have at least one paragraph of these three. You can have more than one paragraph about them, but at least one paragraph about those in these orders, okay? So biographical information about the poet, make sure you're comprehensive and report the highlights of his or her whole life. You don't have to write everything about that person. So if they had a huge career, you're not gonna literally list everything, but you're not also just gonna data dump. You don't wanna just put the information in there. You as the writer should still be like showing your reader why that information is relevant and connecting the dots. Just as like if you had a quote from your short story or the movie or TV show that you analyze for essays 1 and 2, you're not just going to throw a bunch of quotes in your essay and then walk away. You're still going to provide information and show how that information is relevant. So what is the background highlights of their entire life? Next section would be career highlights, publications, and awards. Don't just, again, literally list the awards that are done. What is relevant to your paper? What would be relevant to the reader, interest them? If they have any at all, and so they haven't won any awards or publication, what are their career highlights? Sometimes if somebody is very influential, it might not pop up until later. So there are a lot of authors who sadly their work wasn't extremely successful until after they passed away. There's actually quite a few, and so a lot of authors might not have understood that success or won those awards when they were alive. It might have come later, or maybe there are no awards. Maybe there's just career highlights or something interesting. It depends on the person, right? So you also want to pick somebody who isn't necessarily just an unknown person. Okay, there can be a lot of like not super famous authors who still have a lot of interesting aspects about them, but don't pick somebody that's unheard of. Okay, you still want to pick somebody who there's research to be done on them. Then you have a section about literary criticism, which is that what other people have said about those poems or that author. So provide quotes and from experts who discuss strengths and weaknesses about the poet and their work. If there's any themes or patterns the poet used, this paragraph or this section will use the most quotes, but you still want to like interpret those quotes. You still want to kind of show how they link together. And then you'll have the section, it won't be just one poem, you'll have the section of your first poem that you explicated, and I'll talk about what an explication means in a second. Basically, it just means to analyze. And then the second section for the second poem, okay? And those will be, I think, I'm gonna make sure that I say this right, approximately 500 words per explication, but they can be longer. So if you find that you're struggling to reach the 2,500 word mark, add on to your explication, okay, or bold explications. That's going to be really important. And so those are going to be the crux of your analysis, but you can also analyze, other places too, of course. Your conclusion gives some final perspective. You could summarize or the connection between the poet's life and literary achievement. So kind of make that connection between everything you just talked about. Do not plagiarize. Everything that you find from other people must be cited in MLA format as a works cited page and your in-text citation. I should still see your voice. I should still see how you're connecting your quotes, not just like a data dump. Again, don't write a 5-paragraph essay. You'll have to find ways to kind of connect your paragraphs together, which if the entire paper is about the same poet, shouldn't be that difficult. Okay, it shouldn't be that hard. You're not, so there should be some type of connection between the biological information or biographical information, their career, and the literary criticism, and connecting those, and then building into the poems that you're analyzing. Again, should be at least 2,500 words. Try to avoid the second person you. You could hypothetically use the word I, but you want to avoid like I think, I know, or in my opinion. I've seen a few in conclusions, that doesn't have the word I, but at the end, like in the conclusion, the phrase in conclusion is actually quite unnecessary, because if you're doing it right, if you're writing a quality conclusion, your reader should already know it's a conclusion. Therefore, the phrase in conclusion is unnecessary. And also, like, if you're providing your analysis, in my opinion, is irrelevant because your reader should know that it's your idea. And so trying to avoid talking directly to the reader, but I don't think the review has really been an issue so far. Lots of my other classes in previous semesters have had a really hard time with the review. I don't think you all have had a problem with that. Paraphrase sources, using only a few well-integrated quotes, so make sure your own voice is there. Cite in text and works cited, but if you are paraphrasing or summarizing something, you still need to cite. Cite a minimum of 5 sources, but of course, if you have a lot more information, you definitely can use more, but that's just the minimum, okay? So hopefully this makes it understandable to where what you're doing. I don't have an example for this entire paper. This is the first time I'm assigning anything like this, and the reason I'm doing it this way this semester is because we are so short on time. We only have the month of July. We're working every week. We have something else due, and so because this is a very condensed summer class, I chose to do a different assignment than I normally do, because otherwise it would just kind of be, it would be the other essays we did in June, but times like 10. And so it would be much harder. So I thought condensed time, I'll try to do something that's a little bit more straightforward. But I do have an example explication that I will show you later on in the semester when it gets closer to when we talk more about those explications. I can show you a little bit today later on, but I do have an example explication because that's a little bit harder, but I feel like these instructions are pretty straightforward too. Does anybody have any questions about the essay overall? Okay. Again, I'm also recording this so you can come back if you need to. Okay, so I'm going to go to the explication next. And so again, you can find it on the assignments tab on Blackboard. Again, I have explication number 1 and 2. These are all the same files, but you'll submit them in different places. So the week that we do explications will be week 7. So the week starting with July 19th, I will talk about the example explication then, and I'll introduce the portfolio. I was really struggling this week to figure out what to do without having just like the entire week being a work week. And so I kind of had to wait till I met you all to figure out what we needed. But there will be 2 explication work days just because that week is a little bit rushed and there's 2 papers due versus just the one. The first one will be due Tuesday, July 20th, and the second one will be due Friday, July 23rd. And I really tried to break that up as much as possible. There's just not a lot of time to do so. Even if we have a month, it still becomes a little bit rushed. And so I noticed that there was some need for a little bit more practice with like specific language and paragraph formation with grading essays 1 and 2. And so on Wednesday, the 21st, we'll maybe do some practice on that. And I have those work days on the Tuesday and Thursday, but I also have or another activity as needed. So if there is something that anybody is struggling with, if anybody is struggling with the poetry terms, we could do another activity with that. Or if you just want to work on your explication, if that's been helpful, we can do that as well. So I have the work day, but if we need to do something else, we can as well. So that week 7 will be all about explications. And so explication is a term you may not have heard before. Again, you're going to be writing 2. One is going to be for a different poem. And again, this is very, very, very important. Both poems should be by the same author, and your entire essay should focus on that author. Do not pick 2 different poems by 2 different authors. That is extremely, extremely important. If you write your explication number 1 and number 2 on 2 different authors by 2 different poems, you will have to rewrite one to fit the author, a poem by an author that's by the same author. So it's really important that you pick one author and you find 2 poems by them. Okay, and then you do an explication for each person. I have just talked about the due dates. So an explication is a type of essay where you focus on, or a type of writing assignment that you focus on analyzing a specific poem using poetry terms. So if we did this similar to what we did for essays 1 and 2, you would have a thesis, an introduction, a conclusion, and then the body paragraphs in between supporting that. Okay, this is not like that. You're not going to have a thesis. You're not going to have a formal introduction and conclusion, because these two explications are going to fit within the body of your essay number 3. So if you have a thesis for your overall paper, and then somewhere along the line you have a second thesis and then another thesis, that will be confusing. So your thesis will be for everything combined, like I just talked about for essay 3, but you're not going to have a specific thesis or introduction or conclusion for this. So you're really going to be focusing on understanding the poetry terms, how they apply to the poem you're choosing, and analyzing that information. I have down the bottom, I probably should have focused that on the top. Whenever you include a definition, so you're going to define these poetry terms, which is why they're important to understand, you want to also, in your own words, show what they define them. Okay, so if you say this is a type of poem, like this is a ballad poem, then you need to define what ballad means. If you talk about alliteration, then you need to define what alliteration means. Okay, so that's what explication is. And so it's really focusing on the poetry analysis terms in order for you to analyze your chosen poems. But this is not a regular essay, and you should not have a thesis. Okay, I talked about that multiple times. Okay, you want to use all the poetry terms that you can apply. You don't have to use everything. You don't have to use even everything that you find in the poem. If you have a really long poem, you might find lots of different poetry terms. Also, some people might think that it's easier to analyze a shorter poem, but if you do have a longer poem, you have a lot more to choose from, a lot more ideas. You might have different terms happening in different stanzas. You might have different kinds of writing, and you can compare and contrast them, that type of stuff. But you want to focus on form, sound, language, theme, meaning. It doesn't have to be in any specific order, but you want to definitely think about that. Discuss both concrete and abstract or symbolic aspects of a poem. Whatever you're finding, there's no one term you have to find, because each poem is going to have different aspects that are happening. They're going to use different techniques. So whatever that poem is using. You should have more than one paragraph. Of course, this is not a formal essay with a thesis. You're going to integrate into a larger essay. You don't need an introduction and concluding paragraph. You will have an introductory sentence and a concluding sentence or maybe introduce your explication to transition from the paragraph before or the section before, but not necessarily a thesis or an introductory paragraph. I say use your poetry notes as a guide. That will be what we do today. So it's going to be really important. Use your textbook. All of the pages that I assigned for today have like tons of bolded terms. Those are going to be the terms that you need to kind of understand. And so today, when we get done assigning these assignment sheets, I'm going to have a activity where we try to really learn what they mean, because in order to define them in their own words, and in order to understand how these terms are being used in different poems, we really have to understand what are these different terms actually mean. What are these? What is a stanza? Like what is poetry? We have to understand them ourselves in order to understand how they're being applied in these poems. You don't have to have a fancy title for this. Your title can simply be explication assignment. When you integrate this in your larger paper, you'll delete that title and you're just kind of put it in and transition to where you are. So use your poetry notes, what we do today, as a guide, and also we'll try to analyze them on the next 2 days as well. Do not do research for your poem. It should be your thoughts and your analysis. If you do look something up and you must cite it, okay, but there should be nothing there. You should be, worst case scenario, it's like if there's one term that you need to define and you can't really put it in your own words, you can cite where you found that information from. Keep the whole document academic, third person point of view, thinking about similar to what I just talked about. Your first sentence should include the poem's title, author, and overall summary. So this poem by this person, and then what the poem is about. You must include form, meaning, figurative language, word choice. And you don't have to write all of these. These don't have to be a paragraph for each. You don't have to do them in any specific order. Some might have more than others, but they all should be there in some way to know that you understand what they mean. And your final sentence should wrap up your explication, to wrap up the poem. And again, you must, every time you define or every time you introduce a new term, you must define it. You don't have to define it everywhere you talk about it, but the first time you introduce something, you gotta define it. Does anybody have any questions about the explication? Oh shoot, I wasn't sharing my screen, was I? That hasn't happened in a while. I was looking at the explication assignment sheet, so hopefully you were all looking at it. But this is what I was looking at literally just now, and I was kind of reading off the page at some points and going off of them. Does anybody have any questions about explication? I'm sorry, that was my fault. I should have known. I've been doing so good. Okay. So, and then the last assignment I'm going to be talking about today is the annotated bibliography, which will be for your research that you do for your essay number 3. So when I was planning the kind of second section of the class, the July schedule, I kept going back and forth which week I wanted to do research and which week I wanted to do explication. And I really decided on research being next week, the week of July 12th, specifically because that would give you all a little bit more time to think about which poems you want to analyze and which author you want to use. Okay, so not like so much time, but a little bit more time. So really, the annotated bibliography is due Friday, July 16th. By then, you should know what 2 poems you're using for your explications going to the following week, and what author, and then doing research on that author. You can change your research. You don't have to have those exact sources. You should still, once you have your explications started, you should really not change those poems just because of time. But if you maybe find more credible or more interesting information about their life or what they've done, you can change your sources. But ideally, really starting to look for sources, and ideally using the sources you put in your annotated bibliography. So we'll have next Monday, we'll talk about how to find research, how to use a library database in the college's resource. We'll start focusing on this little book that I told you to get via the semester. It's called a Pocket Style Manual. This is all about research. You don't have to do a complex book entry on them, but I do have page numbers for information that's going to just help understand what I'm talking about more. Next Tuesday, we'll talk about credible sources. Next Wednesday, I know we've done MLA format before, but kind of a refresher, a review. Past several semesters, whenever I do MLA format at the beginning of the semester, usually a lot of people forget what I'm talking about. So it won't be exactly like the first week of class, but it'll be more of a refresher for everybody. And then we'll have an annotated bibliography workshop day if you need any help or questions or whatever we might need. And so the annotated bibliography itself, you will find the 5 sources that you're going to use for your paper. So the 2 poems and the 2 and the 3 outside sources, the secondary sources. And you should write a 1 to 2 paragraph annotation about each source, in addition to citing the source as a works cited MLA citation. So this would be, the way this would work is you would have citation, for it, like annotation, citation, annotation, okay, and then go on so on and so forth. And so for each source, so they should be in alphabetical order. You should not double space your citations, but you should have a correct, or your citation should be double spaced and should have a correct hanging indent for each one. Do not number your citations or bullet points. In the past, I've had a lot of people do that and came to the point where I just said, don't do it, because that's not what you would have in your works cited page, right? Don't number them or bullet point them. Cite your sources in MLA format, not APA. That's also something a lot of people tend to do, is APA versus MLA. Cite each source first and then the annotation underneath. And the annotation should do two things. One, you should summarize the source. So if somebody has not read it, they would know what it's about in your own words. Do not just quote from it. It should be in your own words. And you should specifically explain how each source will be helpful for your essay and how or why each source will be significant to your project. So if you're just talking about your poems, summarize each poem and then maybe talk about why you chose that specific poem. Like, why is this poem interesting to you? How will it connect to other aspects, the other information you found about the poet, the author, connecting that. Why this poem? Out of all the tons of poems that exist out in the world, why is this one interesting to you? How will it connect to the other information you found? So that could be really interesting. Anti-bibliography is worth 50 points overall. Each source will be worth 10 points. And so if you only provide 4, that's only going to be maximum 40 points. Okay, so that's just a breakdown. It's really easy. I'm telling you how that is going to go about right away. So if you cite everything correctly, but you don't provide any annotations, what I'll do, the citation, the summary, and the talking about how that source is significant will all be a third of the 10 points. So if you don't, the part of the annotated bibliography in the past that most people just completely don't add is the section where they need to explain how the source will be helpful to the essay. But that's also the most important part, because that's where I will provide feedback. I'm going to provide feedback on your citations too, because then if you mess up on a citation, you should fix it and then you put it in your essay. There you go, you have that. But the explanation for how or why it's going to be useful to your project, I can kind of see your thought process and I can help provide feedback before you even start writing. And so it's kind of like a pre-writing tactic in that way. By getting your sources, I can see everything. I can make sure they're credible. I can see how they're connecting to each other. Or if they're not, I can provide feedback on that too. So all of the essay number 3 I talked about earlier, but the explications in the annotated bibliography, which you want to have due, also, those are all going to be connected to your essay number 3. So even though we have a lot of assignments, they are still all connected. Does anybody have any questions about any of the assignments I talked about so far today? As I get some water. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.